The borderlands do not forgive carelessness, and I had not been careless in 7 years. I knew the sound of every wind that came through the Highland Pass. I knew the difference between the noise a roe deer makes crossing the frozen stream and the noise a man makes trying not to. I knew which stones shifted under weight and which held, which sections of the ruin's outer wall cast shadow at which hours, and where to stand when I did not want to be seen, which was always, and which I had become expert at. I knew the morning VESSA arrived, that someone was coming. I heard her when she was still a quarter-mile out. Not because she was loud, she was not loud. She was the quietest thing the council had sent in 7 years, which told me something about her before I saw her face. The others had moved the way people move when they are certain of their authority and uncertain of their surroundings, a kind of loud confidence that the borderlands tend to punish. She moved differently. She moved the way I moved, which was the second thing I noted, and the second thing that told me this one was not like the others. I was standing in the inner doorway of the ruin when she came through the outer arch. She stopped when she saw me, not the startled stop of someone who has found what they were looking for ahead of schedule, the deliberate stop of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for on the schedule they had planned, and is taking a moment to confirm the data. She looked at me the way a person looks at a problem they have already solved and are now verifying. Her eyes were dark, steady, unhurried. She had the build of someone who had been moving hard for days and was not going to let that show. She was covered in the dust of the Highland Trail, and she did not appear to notice it. "Aldrin of Kethavar," she said, not a question. "That name," I said, "was stripped 7 years ago." "I know." She did not move from the outer arch. Not advancing, not retreating, she was placing herself at the threshold the way someone places a marker on a map, noting the position. "I know everything the council filed. I also know what they didn't file, which is a longer document." She looked at me with those steady dark eyes. "I've been tracking you for 11 days. "I know," I said. "You lost my trail twice." Something moved in her expression, not offense exactly, more like a recalibration. "Once," she said. It had been twice, but I was interested in her precision, so I let it pass. "What do you want?" I asked, though I knew. They always wanted the same thing, to bring me in, to stand me before the council's seal in public, to watch the seal stay dark and prove what the council had been telling the pack for 7 years. That my bloodline was fraudulent, that my father's line had ended with him, that the man who called himself the true king of Kethavar was a pretender and a deceiver, and deserved his exile. "The seal test," she said. "Council's order, you come willingly or I bring you." "I'd prefer the first." "Why?" She looked at me for a moment. "Because you haven't run," she said. "And a man who doesn't run when he has the chance either can't or has decided he doesn't need to. I'd like to understand which before we travel 3 days together." I studied her. In 7 years, the council had sent 6 people to find me. The first 3 had not found me at all. The 4th had found me, and I had slipped past him in the dark without violence, which I preferred, because violence is expensive, and I had been conserving my resources for something more important. The 5th had found me and made the mistake of assuming that exile means weakness, which it does not. Exile means practice, and practice over 7 years in terrain that punishes error means something close to mastery. He had gone back to the council with a detailed report and both his legs, which was more than he deserved for the quality of his approach. The 6th was standing in my doorway now, and she was better than all of them, and she knew it, and she was not performing the knowledge. "I'll come willingly," I said. She nodded once, clean, no triumph in it. Something in my chest, something that had been cold and quiet for 7 years, the part of me that was not the exile or the strategist or the careful survivor, but the wolf underneath all of it, shifted. I ignored it. I had more pressing concerns. We traveled 3 days. The Highland Pass in early winter is not a comfortable route. The path is narrow in places. exposed in others, and the cold comes down off the watershed with the particular certainty of something that has been doing this for 10,000 years and has no particular interest in accommodating travelers. I had made this route dozens of times in both directions, mostly away from Kethavar, occasionally toward it when I needed to know what was happening inside the walls I was no longer permitted to enter. I knew every shelter, every water source, every position from which I could see who was behind me. VSSA knew most of them. This was not a small thing. The route through the Highland Pass is not marked. The shelters are old hunters' outposts, half collapsed, not on any current map I had seen. The fact that she knew them meant she had done serious preparation, which meant she had been studying Kethavar's older records, the pre-council records, the ones that predated my exile and documented the terrain as my father's pack had known it. She had been thorough. She had been thorough in the direction of understanding me specifically, which was a more precise kind of thoroughness than the council usually commissioned. I asked her about it on the second evening, when we were stopped at the second shelter, and she had made a fire with a competence that told me she was accustomed to doing things herself rather than having them done. "The old records," I said. "You accessed them?" "Yes," she did not look up from the fire. "The council sealed those when they took my name. They sealed them from the general archive. The investigator's archive has a broader access." She glanced at me. "You studied the same records when you were a child. Your father showed you the route." She had read my father's journals. She had read the journals of a man I had not been able to speak of aloud in 7 years, because speaking of him aloud in the wrong company was the fastest way to reveal that I was who I said I was. I sat with this for a moment. "What else did you read?" I asked. "Everything." She said it without apology. "I told you I know what the council filed and I know what they didn't. The seal test is a formality. The council is certain the seal will stay dark. I'm not." I looked at her across the fire. "Why?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet, the quiet of someone who is being precise about what they say next. Because the council's case rests on their interpretation of the bloodline records, and their interpretation has 3 gaps they filled with argument rather than evidence. I don't fill gaps with argument. She looked at me directly. I follow the evidence. The evidence points somewhere the council doesn't want it to go. The wolf in my chest moved again. This time I paid attention to it, because ignoring it the first time had been a choice I made on the grounds that I had more pressing concerns, and the wolf had a habit of being right about things I was too disciplined to acknowledge. He was doing what he did when he recognized something important, not the restless urgency of danger but the slower, deeper movement of recognition. The movement that meant, pay attention. This matters in a way you haven't accounted for. I looked at VESSA across the fire. Her face in the firelight was composed and attentive. She was watching me with the same steady assessment she had used since the doorway, the eyes that took in data and processed it without performance. She was not trying to be anything in particular. She was simply being what she was, which was precise and honest and more intelligent than the council had any idea when they sent her. I thought, this woman is going to walk me into the seal chamber and press my hand to the stone, and she is going to stand there and watch with those eyes while whatever happens happens. I thought, I have been alone for 7 years in the borderlands, and I have had a great deal of time to consider what it would mean if the seal blazed, if the light came, and the bloodline was confirmed, and everything the council had done was undone in one public moment. And I have never once considered what it would mean if someone stood beside me when it happened. I thought, the wolf is not reacting to the idea of vindication. I thought, I am not going to think about this right now. "Go to sleep," I said. "Long day tomorrow." She looked at me for a moment with the expression I had already begun to identify as her version of humor, not a smile exactly, more a deliberate non-reaction that meant she had noted something. "You're very comfortable giving orders for a man without a name," she said. "I have a name," I said. "The council disagreed with it." She was quiet for a moment, then very quietly, as if she was testing the weight of it, "Aldrin." I looked at the fire. "Yes," I said. "Kethavar from the Highland Pass is a thing that does not diminish with time." I had been looking at it from a distance for 7 years, from this pass, from the eastern ridgeline, from the northern overlook, where on clear days you could see the great halls tower above the walls, and it had not become ordinary. I had not wanted it to become ordinary. The wanting was the evidence of the thing I was not willing to be without. The certainty that what had been taken from me was real, that it had existed, that its existence obligated me to survive long enough to reclaim it. My father had built the great hall's east wing. My grandfather had carved the seal chamber from the mountain's heart. My blood was in this stone in a way that the council's arguments could not undo, and I had spent 7 years being certain of that in the privacy of my own chest, in the absence of any external confirmation. Vessa stood beside me at the pass and looked at it. "It's a good hold," she said. "Yes," I said. We went down. The gates opened for her. She had papers from the council, a sealed warrant, the kind of document that makes gates open quickly and people step back. I walked beside her as the gates opened, which was a strange experience. I had entered Kethavar in secret a dozen times in the past 7 years, through the drainage channel at the eastern wall, and once through a gap in the southern perimeter that had been there since before my father's time. Walking through the main gate beside a council investigator in broad daylight was not an approach I had tried. The pack recognized me. I saw it in their faces, the older ones especially, the ones who had been adults when I was named, who had been present in the great hall on the day my father died, and I stood before them and was recognized as his son. The recognition moved through the crowd at the gate the way recognition always moves through a crowd, in a wave, one person to the next, the slight stillness followed by the exchange of glances. No one spoke. Vessa moved with the clean authority of her warrant, and the crowd parted, and I kept my face composed, and we walked through. The council chamber was not the seal chamber. The council had arranged the test in the seal chamber specifically, as a piece of theater. The seal chamber was deep in the mountain, cut from the original stone before the hold was built, older than the pack's recorded history. The seal itself was a disc of iron set into the stone floor, 3 feet across, surrounded by the old carvings that predated the language anyone currently spoke. My grandfather had spent years documenting what he could translate of them. The general understanding was that the seal recognized the bloodline of the true ruling line, that it would blaze golden in the presence of the true king and stay dark for anyone else. The council was certain it would stay dark. They had been certain of this for 7 years, which was why they had made the seal test the public proof of my illegitimacy rather than bothering with the bloodline records, where the gaps in their case were visible to anyone who looked carefully. They had calculated that the seal would not blaze, that I would stand before it and press my hand to the iron and nothing would happen, and the entire pack would see it, and that would be the end of 7 years of questions. I had my own calculation. I had carried it for 7 years in the privacy of my chest, alongside the wanting and the certainty, and the wolf who had been cold and quiet through all of it. The understanding that the seal would know me, because the seal had known every member of my line since before memory, because my grandfather had documented 14 instances of the blazing in the records the council had sealed, because bloodlines are not political arguments and iron remembers what courts choose to forget. What I had not calculated for was Vessa. She walked me down the passage to the seal chamber. The council was already assembled, 7 members, plus the current pack administration, plus the witnesses they had arranged in the chamber's gallery. A carefully managed audience. Enough people to witness the confirmation of my fraudulence, few enough to control the narrative if something unexpected occurred. Vessa's hand was near mine as we walked the passage. The wolf was not cold anymore. He had been moving since the second night at the shelter, the steady increasing movement of a creature approaching something it had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. And now in the passage with the sealed chamber ahead in her hand a few inches from mine, he was doing something he had not done in 7 years. He was present. Fully present. The living, attentive, certain presence that I remembered from before the exile, when he had been the most immediate part of me rather than the most carefully suppressed. I had not planned for this. A man planning for vindication does not also plan for the mate bond, because these are, in the ordinary course of things, separate events. They were not, it turned out, separate events. The seal chamber is cold. It is always cold. The mountain holds the cold in the stone the way the Highland Pass holds it in the air, and the chamber is deep enough that no fire and no body heat has ever warmed it. The iron disc in the floor is the coldest thing in the room. I had touched it once as a child, pressing my small hand to the iron beside my father's large one, and felt the cold of it go all the way to the bone. My father's seal mark had blazed gold the moment his palm touched the iron, and he had looked at me with the expression I had spent 7 years carrying in my memory, the expression of a man who is showing his son something true and permanent and worth keeping. "You'll feel the cold first," he had said, "then you'll feel what's underneath it." VESSA walked me to the seal's edge. The council was ranged along the far wall, 7 faces, with the careful composure of people managing their certainty. The current pack administrator, a man named Doreth who had been one of my father's subordinates and had made his career on the back of my exile, stood at the council's center with the sealed document that would formalize my disgrace once the seal confirmed it. VESSA looked at me. "Ready?" she asked. Not the question of a captor, she said it the way she had said everything, plainly and with genuine inquiry. "Yes," I said. I knelt at the seal's edge and pressed my palm flat against the iron. The cold went to the bone the way it always had. I kept my eyes open. Beside me, VESSA crouched to observe. This was her role as the investigating officer, to witness and document the result. Her hand was on the iron's edge beside mine, not on the seal itself, steadying herself as she leaned forward. And the seal blazed. Not the faint recognition glow that the records described for minor bloodline confirmation. The full blaze, the golden light that the seal's oldest carvings described in the language my grandfather had spent years translating, the light that meant the true king, the rightful line, the one the iron had been waiting for. It came up through the disc and lit the chamber from below, warm gold in the cold stone, filling every corner, throwing every face in the room into sharp relief. The council went still. Doreth's composure broke. Just barely, a tightening around the eyes, the kind of thing you see in a person whose certainty has just been violated. The witnesses in the gallery made sounds. Someone near the back said something I couldn't hear. I kept my hand on the iron and looked at the light. And then the seal blazed again. Not brighter, different. A second resonance, a second frequency of the same gold light, rippling outward from the center the way a stone thrown in still water sends rings in all directions. I had read my grandfather's documentation of 14 seal blazes, and not one of them described a second resonance. The carvings around the seal's edge, which in the first blaze had lit with the lines my grandfather had translated as bloodline and true king, now lit with a second set of lines that he had documented and never translated, lines he had labeled unknown purpose, possibly ceremonial. VESSA's hand was on the seal's edge. Not pressing, not intentional. She had steadied herself at the iron's rim, and her fingers were resting against the seal's outer ring, which was technically part of the seal's surface, which was, it turned out, enough. The second resonance was running from my palm to her fingers. I looked at her. She was staring at the seal with the expression of a person who has arrived at the end of a very long calculation and found that the answer is not what they expected and is also larger than the question they were asking. Her steady dark eyes were wide, which was the first time I had seen them wide. The first time in 3 days of watching her that her composure had done something other than hold. She looked up at me. "What is that?" she said. The question had nothing in it of the investigator. It was a plain, human question, asked by someone who needed to understand something immediately. I looked at the untranslated carvings, now blazing with their unknown purpose beside the blazing of my bloodline confirmation. I looked at the second resonance running between my hand and hers. I looked at the wolf in my chest, who was doing something he had not done in 7 years, who was making the sound my father had described when he told me about the mate bond, the particular low resonance that means found, finished looking here. "I believe," I said carefully, "that it is the seal recognizing something it considers relevant alongside the bloodline." "What something?" she asked. "The old carvings use a word my grandfather couldn't translate." I kept my voice level. "He documented it as unknown purpose, possibly ceremonial. In the context of the bloodline confirmation section, his best approximation was the one who stands beside." VESSA looked at the seal for a long moment. Then she looked at me. The investigator's assessment was entirely gone from her face. What was there instead was something I recognized, because it matched what I felt. The expression of a person who had been looking for one thing and found something considerably larger. "The mate bond," she said. "Yes." She was quiet. Behind us, the council chamber had not recovered. Doreth had the expression of a man whose entire architecture of certainty has been disassembled in public, and he was having difficulty deciding which part to address first. The other council members were exchanging the kind of glances that precede a significant revision of position. The witnesses in the gallery were making sounds that were going to take some time to settle. "You didn't know," VESSA said. "It was not a question." "I knew the first part," I said, "not the second." She looked at the seal, still blazing, both resonances, the bloodline and the unknown purpose side by side in gold light. Then she looked at her own hand, still resting at the seal's edge. She did not remove it. "The council sent me to expose you," she said. "Yes." And instead, I said, "you confirmed me, both the bloodline and," I paused, "the other matter." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The second resonance, in your grandfather's documentation, he really couldn't translate it. He had 12 possible interpretations. He favored the one who stands beside. His second choice was the mate who completes the line." Another silence. "He documented 14 seal blazes," she said. "Any of them show a second resonance?" "No." She absorbed this. "So this is the first time it's happened." "In recorded history, yes." VESSA looked at the seal for a long time. I watched her profile in the gold light, the composed face, the steady eyes, the particular quality of her attention that I had spent 3 days observing and had come to understand was not coldness but precision. She gave her full attention to what was in front of her, and she did not perform the giving. She was giving her full attention to this now, to the blazing seal, to her hand at its edge, to what it meant. She turned and looked at me. "Aldrin," she said. "Yes." "I need you to understand that I came here with a warrant to expose a man the council called a fraud. I did my job honestly. I read everything. I followed the evidence. And I brought you here because the evidence and the seal test were the right process, even if I had reservations about the council's conclusions." "I know," I said. "And the seal has now," she stopped, started again. "The seal has now done 2 things, one of which I anticipated as a possible outcome, one of which I absolutely did not." "I know," I said. She looked at me. "I'm not saying I'm opposed to it," she said, with the particular precision of someone being very careful to say exactly what they mean and nothing more or less. "I'm saying I need to understand what it means before I respond to it." I had spent 7 years in the borderlands, developing a very high tolerance for patience. What would help you understand it? I asked. She looked at the seal again, at the second resonance still running from my palm to her fingers, at the gold light that had been blazing for longer than any seal activation in the recorded 14, which suggested that whatever the iron was recognizing, it was not in a hurry to stop recognizing it. "Tell me about your grandfather's documentation," she said. "The untranslated section, all 12 interpretations." I told her. We sat beside the seal on the cold stone floor of the chamber, the council still assembled along the wall, Doreth still frozen in his disassembled certainty, the witnesses still making their unsettled sounds, and I told her everything my grandfather had documented about the carvings around the seal's edge, the section he had labeled unknown purpose, the 12 interpretations he had considered and rejected and reconsidered over 30 years of study. She listened with the quality of attention that I had first noticed at the shelter on the second night, when I had told her about my father's journals, and she had not filled the silence with anything. She listened as though listening was a serious act and deserved her full seriousness. Her hand stayed at the seal's edge through all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "His second interpretation," she said, "the mate who completes the line." "Yes." "Is there a third?" He had 12. "His third was the witness who validates the blood. His fourth was the one whose presence the iron remembers." She considered this. "The one whose presence the iron remembers," she repeated. "That one is interesting." My grandfather thought so too. He spent 7 years on it before moving to the others. Why did he abandon it? He didn't. He said it was possibly all the same thing, that the seal's language might not distinguish between mate, witness, and remembered presence in the way we do, because the distinction might not have existed when the carvings were made. I paused. He thought the seal might be recognizing something more fundamental than the relationship category, something prior to the naming. VESSA turned this over. I watched her do it, the careful internal processing that her face showed in its particular way, not revealing the contents but making the movement visible. "Something prior to the naming," she said slowly, "like the bond itself, before either of us knew what to call it." "Yes." She looked at me. The gold light was still blazing from the iron. It had been blazing for a considerable time. Behind us, I could hear Doreth finally saying something to his colleagues, and the sound of it was the sound of someone constructing a new position from the wreckage of the old one, the particular quality of voice that means, "We are going to have to account for this, and we had better agree on how." "Aldrin," VESSA said. "Yes." "The wolf in your chest, right now, what is he doing?" I had not expected this question. Not because it was inappropriate, it was entirely appropriate, and she had every right to ask it, but because it required me to say aloud something I had been keeping very carefully internal since the second night at the shelter. "He is doing what wolves do," I said, "when they are finished looking." She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she turned her hand over at the seal's edge, the hand that had been resting against the iron, and held it open, palm up, beside mine, not grabbing, not demanding, offering. I put my hand in hers. The second resonance blazed brighter. The council session that followed was the longest I had sat through, and I had sat through my father's death council, which had lasted 14 hours and ended with my exile. This one was 4 hours and ended with a formal reversal. The council's declaration of fraudulence retracted, the bloodline confirmed, the exile records amended, the name restored. Doreth did not lead the session. He sat in the back and said nothing, which was a wise choice, and I noted that he made it and noted what it said about his actual beliefs regarding the situation, that he was not a man with convictions, he was a man with positions, and his positions followed whatever the room decided. VESSA sat beside me through the 4 hours. She did not have to. Her role as the investigating officer had technically concluded when the seal test produced its result. She had completed her commission, unusual result and all, and she could have left. She stayed. She sat beside me on the council floor with the composed attention she gave everything. And when the council's questions became circular or evasive, she asked the direct version of the question they were avoiding, which tended to move things along considerably. By the third hour, 2 of the council members were deferring to her analysis of the bloodline record gaps, which was the most precisely I had seen anyone navigate a Kethavar council session in my adult memory. My father would have liked her. When the session concluded, the PAC administrator who replaced Doreth in the session's final phase, a younger woman, sharp and fair, who had clearly been waiting for this kind of opportunity for some time, stood and addressed the gallery witnesses and the assembled PAC staff in the formal language of a name restoration, which I had heard twice in my life and had spent 7 years imagining hearing a third time. She spoke my name. She spoke my father's name. She spoke the holding of the line, confirmed by the seal, confirmed by the record. And then she paused, consulting something, VESSA's documentation. I realized, the report she had been filing throughout the session. And she spoke one more thing. The old language phrase that my grandfather's records described as the seal's companion declaration, the second resonance's meaning in the carving's original grammar. The phrase translated roughly as, and the one who stands beside, recognized by the iron. The gallery was very quiet. I looked at VESSA. She was looking at the floor with the expression of a person who is processing something large, and has decided to do it in private while it is happening in public, which I recognized because it was how I handled things too. VESSA, I said quietly. I heard, she said without looking up. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at me and her steady dark eyes were entirely present, the investigator's assessment completely gone, something older and truer in its place. I followed the evidence, she said. That's what I do. The evidence has gone somewhere I didn't anticipate. She paused. I'm not opposed to where it went. You said that earlier. I meant it both times. I looked at her for a long moment. The seal chamber was empty now. The council had moved to the main hall, the witnesses dispersed, the session formally concluded. We were alone in the cold stone room with the iron disc in the floor, which had finally dimmed to a low warmth, the kind of settled glow of something that has said what it needed to say and is content to wait for the rest to follow. There are things that will need to be decided, I said. The Holds administration, the council restructuring, 7 years of governance gaps. I paused. None of it is simple. No, she said. It will take time. Yes, she looked at me directly. Are you asking me to stay while you sort it? I am asking, I said carefully, if you want to. She considered this with the precision she applied to everything. The council's commission is concluded, she said. My professional obligation is complete. She tilted her head slightly. My personal situation is, she glanced at the seal. Now its dim, warm glow, somewhat more complicated. Yes. I don't do complicated without understanding what I'm dealing with, she said. So tell me, what does the second resonance mean, in practice, beyond the seal's declaration? I told her. Plainly, the way she had told me things, without the hedges and the careful framings, the way my father had told me about the mate bond the one time we had discussed it directly, which was, it means you will not be the same man after as you were before, and the change is not a loss of yourself, but the arrival of the self you were always moving toward. She listened the way she always listened, entirely without performance. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. 7 years, she said. Yes. You were in the borderlands for 7 years. Yes. And the wolf was cold through all of it. Cold and quiet, I said, until 3 days ago. She looked at me. The shelter, she said, the second night. Yes. She absorbed this. Then he knew before you did. He usually does, I said. I've been trying to catch up. Something moved in her expression, the deliberate non-reaction that I had identified as her version of humor, but warmer this time, the edges of it less controlled. I've been told, she said, that I'm difficult to catch up to. I noticed, I said. You lost my trail once. Twice, she said immediately, and then stopped, and the almost smile became something more definite. I looked at her. The wolf was warm. The seal was warm. The cold stone hall was what it had always been, my grandfather's carving in my father's hold, the mountain's patient certainty underneath everything. And I had been standing outside it for 7 years, and I was standing inside it now. And the difference between those two things was real and total, and I had spent enough time being certain it would happen that I could afford, now that it had, to be honest about how much it meant. Stay, I said. Not a command. I had done 7 years in the borderlands learning the difference between a command and a request, and the difference was not in the word, but in whether you gave the other person the full weight of the choice and meant it. I meant it. I had given a great deal of power to a great many people in 7 years, to the cold, to the terrain, to the necessity of survival. But I had never given the choice to anyone else, and I found that giving it now to this woman felt less like a loss of something than like the correct use of an authority I had not known I had. Stay, I said. As long as you want, leave when you want, but I would like very much for you to stay. Vessa looked at me for a long time with her steady dark eyes. All right, she said. The pack named me in the great hall 3 days later, in the old rite, with the full assembly. The stable hands and the gate guards and the court wolves and the council and the dock workers and the river traders, and all the people who had been living in Kethavar, while I was living in the borderlands, who had been told one version of the truth for 7 years, and were now being told another. It was a long session. The truth tends to take longer to present than the version that replaced it, because the truth is usually more complicated. Vessa sat beside me. Not because I had asked her to. This time, I had not asked. The first asking had been enough, and I was not a man who needed to ask twice. She had simply arranged herself beside me in the great hall with the same composed efficiency she arranged everything, and she was there when the hall filled, and she was there when the naming began, and she was there when the old language phrase was spoken a second time. The seal's companion declaration, the one the pack administrator had read from the session record, and the hall went quiet in the way that halls go quiet when they are understanding something new and are deciding what to do with it. Dorath was not present. He had tendered a resignation the morning after the seal session, which was the wisest political move available to him and which I had expected. The new administration was taking shape around the senior staff, who had maintained competence and integrity through the 7 years of my absence, which turned out to be more of them than I had feared when I was in the borderlands imagining the worst. When the naming was finished, the hall bowed. Not in the political way, not the bow of people who have recalculated their position and are aligning with the new power. The people who had been living in Kethavar for 7 years bowed the way the pack bows when something true is recognized. Without being asked, without coordination, the movement passing through the crowd like a current that had found the shape of the bed it was meant to follow. I looked at Vessa. She was looking at the hall, at the bowing pack, at the winter light coming through the great hall's windows, at Kethavar's stone and iron, and the people who had been living in it through 7 years of someone else's governance. She was taking it in the way she took everything in, attentively, without performance, giving it her full and genuine consideration. "What are you thinking?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I need to review the eastern boundary records. The council's 7-year administration created some irregularities that are going to need careful untangling." I looked at her. "That's what you're thinking." That's the first thing I'm thinking, she said. There are others. Tell me one. She turned and looked at me. In the great hall's winter light, her eyes were the color I had first seen them in the borderland ruins' cold doorway, dark and steady and entirely present. I'm thinking, she said, that your grandfather spent 30 years on 12 interpretations of a set of carvings, and his first interpretation was the one who stands beside. And it was probably right the whole time, and all the other 11 were him not trusting the simplest answer. I looked at her. Probably, I said. It's usually the simplest answer, she said. Not always. Often enough that you should check it first. I looked at the hall, the pack, the stone, the winter light, the iron fittings my grandfather had specified, the east wing my father had built, all of it present and specific and mine again after 7 years of distance. I had spent those years being certain it would come back, and the certainty had been the anchor, and now that it had come back I found that the certainty had been right, and also that it had not accounted for everything. It had not accounted for VESSA beside me when the seal blazed. It had not accounted for the wolf, warm and present, or the second resonance, or the old language phrase that my grandfather had documented and not translated. It had not accounted for the way the simplest answer, the one who stands beside, had turned out to be a person rather than a position. The Eastern Boundary Records, I said. Yes, she said. I'll have them pulled for you this afternoon. Good. She looked at the hall again. You should probably also appoint an interim council before the end of the week. The pack needs visible governance while the restructuring is happening. I know. And the borderlands route, the Highland Pass infrastructure, needs maintenance. 7 years of no investment has left it in poor condition. I spent 7 years on it, I said. I know exactly what it needs. She glanced at me. Of course you do, she said, with a particular tone that was not quite a smile. You walked it 11 days ago. Twice, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then the almost smile became actual, and it was the first time I had seen it fully, not the controlled non-reaction but the real thing, brief and warm and exactly what I had thought it would be. She looked at the hall and I looked at her, and the wolf in my chest was warm and quiet in the way of a creature that has arrived somewhere and has no intention of leaving. 7 years in the borderlands teaches you to be patient with things you cannot rush, and to move quickly when the moment requires it, and to know the difference. The difference is usually the wolf. He knows before you do, and the only mistake is not trusting him. He had been right about VESSA from the second night in the shelter. He had been right that the seal would know me. He had been right, as he was always right, as my father had told me he would be, about the one who stands beside. I had been catching up to him for 3 days. I thought, nearly there.